Hey, I'm Nick DiMatteo, and welcome to Season 7, Episode 17 of Music is Not a Genre, MxG. That was sloppy. Thank you as always for watching and listening. Listeners, go to youtube.com/@musicisnotagenre. You get a video for every episode of this podcast. Watchers, go to nickdimatteo.com/musicisnotagenre if you'd rather not see this pretty nondescript shirt I'm wearing and just listen. And everyone, go to patreon.com/musicisnotagenre to support this podcast, my band Rec, and everything I do. There is no sponsor for this podcast at the moment. I am looking for sponsors. If you would like to advertise something, please contact me. And I say that because I have recently changed distributors. I was on a network for a couple of years that did me just fine, and I felt like I needed to move on and explore other options. And now I am on the JamX network, and I'll be there for a little while, see how it goes, and hopefully that will garner me some sponsors and some more, views and, more listens at least, and all of that, which means I can get right into the topic now and don't have to worry about hawking anything else. And the topic this week, oh boy, is, good Lord, people, the history of Christian music. So, first of all, before I say why I'm doing this, I want to make a larger point, which is lately I have been doing some podcasts on what I would call global topics, like country music, like this one, Christian music. Next week is going to be protest music, which is going to be a real head-spinning thing for me because I'm recording these two back to back, and they are connected but disparate. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because so many of these topics you'll find connections in. Even the podfast I did with the connections between Philly and New Orleans, there's some connection within this one to that one as well. And I love that because that's part of what Music is Not a Genre is about. And it shows you that despite, codifying and confining music into certain genres or areas or quadrants or fans, there's a lot more crossover than we realize. I think that is true in life as well with people. And especially next week, you're going to hear me say a lot about that. But this week, history of Christian music. Why am I doing this topic? Well, first of all, full disclosure, I was born and raised Catholic, Roman Catholic. I am a lapsed Catholic, one of millions, I'm sure, in the world. Still, respect the upbringing and respect the fundamental aspects of the religion, if not always how it is practiced or preached. But I do not practice myself. And that's partly because I'm not a fan of preachiness in any form. So I believe that if you have ideas you want to expound on, there are better ways to do it than to just kind of point and preach. Because you're either preaching to the choir, which nobody needs to hear that, or some people might to continue to feel it, but most people, they already know it. Or you're preaching to people who aren't going to listen to you because you're talking at them and not with them. It gets deterministic. You're giving answers as if you really know them, when a lot of faith really is about not knowing but believing anyway, etc., etc. So those pseudo-religious people who are constantly preaching at everyone saying they know the answers are false. They are false. It's also for sure that religious music by nature is probably the preachiest music out there. Now, that's not necessarily true, and it's not true in all cases, because there's plenty of Christian music that's more subtle, or has some other like joyous, intent and just celebration kind of thing. May have questions, whatever, but for the most part, it's pretty preachy because that's sort of the intent. Although you'll find that a lot of protest music itself is preachy, and other kinds of music out there. But I think as far as the reputation, at least, we would say that Christian music and religious music in general can be pretty preachy. So I'm going to explore this. I'm going to find the music and artists who leave room for doubt and humanity, and I am going to declare which Christian music works beyond the choir, beyond preaching to the choir. Some of that. And that kind of goes into the bonus MXtra video at patreon.com/musicisnotagenre, which is mainstream artists we had no idea were actually Christian artists. I find this fascinating. I've been surprised here and there over the years. I think you will be too. So join me at patreon.com to check out that bonus MXtra video. Sources here this week: Wikipedia, Google, although I fact check it because the AI is not always correct, Britannica.com, Pathos.com, Apple Music had a playlist of some Christian artists I needed to look at, RelevantMagazine.com, and believe it or not, Reddit and BuzzFeed had some, Reddit had a good conversation about this, and BuzzFeed had a good article about it. Some disclaimers. Yes, I'm a lapsed Catholic, which means I know more than I should about this topic, but not as much as actual Christian music fans. And I'm likely you're going to hear me say things that may be somewhat biased against this kind of music. I am going to always qualify that by saying it's not my bag and it might be your bag, and that's totally fine. I got my degree in music at Rutgers, but this is not a history of actual religious music of any kind, including Christian music, though I will give a brief overview of the history of church music to kind of set the stage for why contemporary Christian music is different. And you'll hear me say contemporary Christian music, or CCM, quite often in this podcast. I'm going to focus only on the music that has a life outside of the church and worship, even though it might be used as well in the church and for worship. I'm going to miss some artists, going to miss some key songs as always. I hope that you'll help me fill that in. And finally, this will not be about popular music from other religions. So no Matisyahu, for example. And that's not because I don't respect all of that. It just hasn't had near the impact of Christian popular music, and at least not in the West, of course. And it would just take way too long. Let me just say that. So some prehistory. We're getting right into it. This is the prehistory here. You can bet Christian music started when the church did, because music was already around. They probably got most of their melodies from Jewish songs, or maybe some other popular songs in, Greek and Roman culture. That's often how some religious songs are written, is just co-opting another melody, which is a great thing to do. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, there's a mention in the Gospel of Matthew of singing hymns during the Last Supper. They were singing during the Last Supper. And even early popes and scholars in the first couple centuries AD mention singing, or CE, you could say Common Era. But I think because it's Christian topic this week, I could say AD. They mentioned singing. Consider that the Psalms were all songs. Keep that in mind. I actually mentioned that next week too. As the Greek word means song sung to a harp. Psalin means to pluck. So a psalm is a song sung to a harp. You can bet they were sung and not just recited. Many of them have been set to music. But even back then, musical elements were a formal part of worship as early as the 3rd century, and likely earlier. There are no extant songs from these eras, though we can guess that they sounded like early versions of chant, since that's what came next. Plain chant and Gregorian chant were monophonic types of chants, meaning one note. Might have been singing unison at an octave maybe, but it was just a single note. There were no harmonies. There was no accompaniment. It was a cappella. It took the church several hundred years to allow polyphony, or harmony, into church services. It might have been there as early as the 9th century. So that's a long freaking time. That's almost a millennia. But wasn't officially part of services until the 12th or 13th centuries. Yikes, even longer. And that was called organum. And I studied all this. I forget most of it, but I studied all of this in school. And the reason I study this is something I'll bring up later, which is that Christian music, Catholic music in particular, church music, and the church itself, the benefactors, played a huge part in the development of Western music in general. Keep in mind that almost all of this, up to this point, 12th, 13th century, was a cappella music. Literally means a cappella in the style of the chapel, because instruments weren't sanctioned for a very long time. They did start to trickle in maybe around the 600s, depending on which church and where you were, et cetera, et cetera. Didn't really increase until the 12th century. And it really took until the 16th century for instruments to become commonplace and widely accepted, and I would imagine sanctioned by the church. So a millennium and a half before they allowed instruments in there. At that time, this would have been Renaissance. Palestrina was a huge composer, made a huge impact on composers to come. He was the leading Renaissance composer. You can credit the Catholic Church and other Catholic benefactors, again, as I mentioned before, for developing Western music in general. Notation, the Do Re Mi, which was by Guido d'Arezzo. Many famous composers made a living and developed their art and the art of music in general because of the church, such as Dietrich Buxtehude, who came, did he come before Handel? I don't know. Bach came before Bach for sure, and on. They all made a lot of money from the church. And good for them, because that's how they developed their art and created it and can make a living. The history of Catholic music is like the church itself, proscribing things that were considered too worldly or earthly or garish for centuries and centuries, probably until they were normalized in the regular culture and finally deemed not a threat, if they ever really were a threat. So harmony was once a threat. Instruments were once a threat. Non-Latin lyrics were not only once a threat, but they were a threat until the 1960s. And in fact, some Catholic people, the more conservative wing, still consider non-Latin masses to be a threat. And yes, that change in the 1960s, Vatican Council II, which we knew of as Vatican II, allowed for non-Latin masses, so also non-Latin songs. And this played a big part in the development of popular Christian music, though not the first step, as we'll see now. So that was the prehistory. Let's get into the early history. And you'll hear me mention this next week. I've mentioned it in other episodes, especially when it comes to like the long history of something. I love going as far back as I can. And we usually get to this point, which is the dawn of not just recorded music, because that happened in the 1800s, late 1800s, but the dawn of affordable recorded music, which was really the 20s into the 30s, 1920s into the 30s. And I consider this the first watershed for Christian music, for contemporary Christian music. As with all music, of course, nothing was strictly black or white. Gospel of the late 19th and early 20th century started incorporating white hymns and syncopating them. So there was a crossover from the very beginning, and it's important to say because there are going to be different strains of Christian music that cross back and forth or that kind of silo themselves, etc. With the dawn of affordable recorded music in the 1920s and the 30s came the recording of all kinds of gospel. You'll notice, so you'll notice that a lot of what I'm saying is not only connected to the country music episode and to the some others from last season, but also the Philly and New Orleans episode. The first artist to cross over into the pop world would have been country or gospel. Through the 1920s, through the 50s, meaning popular Christian music recordings have been around as long as recordings themselves. Sure, it's just like anything else. Funny to mention this in this, topic in this episode. But, porn has been around as long as video has been around. I mean longer, but I mean video, that type of porn with motion. And, so has religious things. So has anything really. As soon as technology is something a lot of people can use, they explore it in every way possible. It's more likely than not that most country and blues artists of the 1920s through 40s recorded at least some Christian music, both in the country and blues traditions, either traditional or newly composed. Those early artists include the Carter family, mentioned in the country episode, Reverend C.A. Tindley, mentioned in the Philly and NOLA episode, to name one from each discipline among dozens, if not hundreds. Which brings me to the second watershed, which is church music influencing pop music and vice versa. So this watershed number two. By the 1950s and early 1960s, gospel began seriously influencing pop music, shaping in a big way genres like soul, R&B, pop, and rock. And would go on to do that for years and decades and still does. And you had relatively popular gospel artists like the Soul Stirrers, the Statesmen, the Blind Bullies of Alabama. They were pretty popular, even though they may not have been on the actual pop charts, so to speak. Little Richard himself switched to gospel in the late 1950s and recorded quite a few gospel albums after that. And let's not forget Elvis's big gospel album in 1960, his first of two, I believe. And I did an Elvis episode, and I'm saying I believe because I tend to forget most things I talk about. You know, it's like studying for a test in school where you cram, you get to know everything, you get as many answers right as you can, and then you forget most of it afterwards. It's just because if you don't repeat it, as my song says from one of Rex's albums, the power of repetition is the song. There is power in repetition. So at the same time, in this 50s and 60s, church music itself was being influenced by pop music. So there was some crossover there. As per tradition, the various Christian churches were decidedly not into popular music for at least the first half of the 20th century, including and especially rock music. Forget that ever coming close to the church at the time. As Protestant churches grew, especially evangelical, and usually white evangelical, they started to allow more popular music into worship to attract new members. Now, this is something that happens frequently in history where if you are successful to a degree, in whatever way you may say that is, but usually financially or in terms of membership, however you want to classify it, you don't need to expand. You may want to, but it's not an imperative. So your rules can be pretty strict and it doesn't matter. But when that starts to be threatened, as it has, over and over again, especially in a lot of denominations in the last several decades, you need to reconsider what some of those rules are in order to entice more people to join. So that's one of the reasons why church music was becoming more influenced by popular music. Eventually, after Vatican II, which was from 1962 to 65, the Catholic Church changed its music rules too. So, as I mentioned, grew up Catholic. I went to church just about every week up until my probably late teens, early 20s. And then to a large degree after that, up until maybe my 30s even, I heard basically three kinds of worship music throughout all that time. Chants for things like the responsorials, parts of the Mass. Traditional hymns like, "So my Savior, to thee, how great thou art," and things like that. And of course, Amazing Grace and all of that. And then what I call granola music, which was usually a bearded dude with an acoustic guitar, maybe accompanied by somebody on a tambourine, usually a woman, maybe who was also singing harmony, or they were co-singing in one way or another. It was very folk-based, and it was very white. It was a nice break from the other kinds of music. Not that I didn't like them. I like a little bit of all kinds of music, but at the time it was a nice break. It started to get pretty tedious by the 80s and 90s. Which brings me to Watershed 3, a new movement and a new genre. So we're doing really well here on time. This won't be a very long episode, but who knows? This whole thing about the church allowing more of that folky music in and folk music itself being influenced by church music came from a movement called the Jesus movement, which was very akin to and inspired by both the hippies and the New Age and Eastern movements, all about exploring spirituality and your connection with the world and all of that. The people were known as Jesus hippies or Jesus people, and even the one I remember the best, Jesus freaks, which is something they actually came up with themselves. I'm sure it was also used disparagingly. And at the same time, Black Baptist, Methodist, and Presbyterian churches were reaching out more, and gospel music was much more prominent in the pop world, as I mentioned. So by the mid to late 1960s, we had these twin movements blowing up, both driven by Protestant revivalism, both crossing over each other, and both bleeding heavily into popular music. Some albums and singles had hit the charts through the years, but it's fair to say that the two biggies were, again, Elvis's first gospel album, His Hand in Mine, in 1960, which went to number 13 in the charts, and especially in 1963, The Singing Nun, which was a number one album that year. Not the number one, but a number one of the top number one albums of the year. You also had, at that time, something I never heard, and that cough was free for you. A band called the Joy Strings was a British pop group from the Salvation Army who had pretty decent success for a few years. And these are the things you discover when you research a topic. And I have to say, and I may say this later too, just to reiterate, but there was not as much research and writing on contemporary Christian music as I thought there would be. It was hard to cobble this episode together. You're welcome. Patreon.com/musicisnotagenre if you'd like to support this work. But I had fun. I wanted to tell you when the first Christian album or single entered the pop charts, but I couldn't find that info. We can assume it was Elvis, but that is not necessarily a fair assumption. It might have been artists before then, even in the 40s. Although albums didn't really kind of exist in the 40s. Let's say sometime in the 50s, but I don't know. No one made a note of that anywhere on any website. Christian music wasn't really considered its own genre, though, until the late 1960s. And it's often said that Larry Norman is the father of Christian rock or contemporary Christian music. He kicked it off with the first official Jesus Movement album, not the first official contemporary Christian album by any stretch, but the first Jesus Movement album. So it had a rock kind of feel, and he called it Upon This Rock, which was a nice double entendre. It was even called the Sgt. Pepper of Christianity. It blended folk, rock, and psychedelic elements. At that time, in the late 60s, you also have to give credit to Andre Crouch and the Disciples, and Barry McGuire, who after the song Eve of Destruction, which if I remember, I will mention in next week's episode on Protest Music Connection, Barry McGuire eventually pivoted to Christian music. Big pivot. Although maybe not as big as we think. The watershed of this period is that prior to this era, Christian music stayed in its own lanes, whether it was gospel or traditional. So really black or white. But by the late, although again, I say crossovers happened all the time, but by the late 1960s, you had people like Larry Norman taking cues from all kinds of pop music, which would set the template for Christian music for really the rest of its existence. In other words, pick a style or genre, do it faithfully in both senses of the word, meaning faithful to the genre, but faithful to Christianity, such as an actual psychedelic rock song with Christian lyrics. Which brings me to another watershed number 4, the 1970s and 80s, chart success and the advent of contemporary Christian music, CCM. CCM, if you look up CCM, you're going to get a lot of hits on that. By the 1970s, CCM had its own engine, was humming along and growing, if not quite shattering the charts. Lots of artists took cues from the Jesus movement and either towed the line and kept that kind of, light rock, folky feel, or went their own way. Towing the line might have been people like Paul Clark and Randy Stonehill, both of whom are continuing to perform and make contemporary Christian music, very folky, very traditional. But in the early 70s, you also had bands like Petra, started in 1972, as one of the first Christian rock bands, hard rock. In this case, more or less Southern hard rock. And they would go on to massive success in the 80s and 90s, doing more of a mainstream hard rock sound, veering away from the Southern rock sound, but still very, very much Christian rock. You also had Servant, which was a rock band from Canada, started in 1996. And all of this growth in the 70s brought about CCM magazine, which started publishing in 1978 and would start to show, charts and more news and whatever else a music magazine does, which is a big step. Anyone who goes into the publishing world, and not just today, of course, especially today, because print, is dying or dead, but even back then, you're taking a big risk, so they had to feel like it was a worthy risk. This actually predated the biggest successes of contemporary Christian music, which started really happening in the early 1980s and steadily grew throughout that decade and into the 90s. That was kind of the Christian music heyday. It was like maybe, 20 years or so. Artists like Benny Hester, who'd been around since the 1960s, would start to cross over, if not to the mainstream pop charts, then at least to the adult contemporary charts. His single, Nobody Knows Me Like You, was the first to break the top 50 adult contemporary in 1981. Sandy Patty was huge as well. She's still around. And this growth had a dual effect on the music. And it inspired musicians of all kinds to enter the CCM world, paralleling growth in the non-Christian music world and with the same genres, including new wave, such as Christian new wave bands the 77s in 1979, Krumbacher in 1983, punk, Altar Boys started in 1982, Undercover in the early 1980s, alt-rock, indie rock, Adam Again, 1982, very funky alt-rock, The Choir, 1984, more ambient alt-rock, metal bands were Christian, and of course the one I remember the first and the most, in fact, this is the first non-secular band I remember taking any notice of, having any knowledge of, and that is Stryper. To Hell with the Devil, 1986. I don't think that was their first album, but it's the one everybody remembers the most. King's X, briefly, somewhat erroneously considered Christian, but, shook that off pretty quickly. These were all pioneers in the coming explosion of alt-Christian musicians in the 90s. So there were a lot of this in the 80s, underground, not that popular. I would say Stryper was probably they got, I believe they got in Rolling Stone. I don't know. But they were popular enough to make a lot of headlines. And maybe some people knew their songs. I'm sure I heard a couple of their songs, although I don't remember them. Side note, in fact, about them, that other than a few years in the 1990s when they were broken up, they've been together ever since, I want to say, the early 80s or late 70s, and released an album in 2024, which I didn't have time to listen to before this episode, but I'm telling you, I'm going to, because I'm curious to see where Stryper is as of now. And the second effect that this had is that as the mainstream got wind of the growing CCM movement, artists from both sides of the divide started to cross over. So you had the biggie contemporary Christian artists crossing into the mainstream, like Amy Grant. She had a 1985 top 40 hit, Find a Way, which I didn't know I remember, but I do. Her duet with Peter Cetera, The Next Time I Fall, in 1986 was number one. And of course, Baby Baby was her big hit in 1991, and we'll talk more about that later. And Michael W. Smith in 1991, Place in This World, hit number 6. They were friends, touring partners, contributors to each other's recordings. And so you had non-CCM artists incorporating Christian themes into their music, like Bob Dylan, Johnny Cash, The Call, U2, Sam Phillips, not the producer, but the awesome female singer-songwriter, Prince, and so many others incorporated Christian themes and religion into their music. Many in the community say that Amy Grant spearheaded this, and she's even quoted in the early 1980s as saying, and I love this quote, "I felt like any song with a spiritual message had a greater impact if it were heard around a lot of songs about regular life. I just feel like if every song talks about Jesus, I feel like I don't have any credibility as a human being." One of my big contentions with any artist who sticks to one topic. I'm a huge believer in this. Though my musical mission has never been about preaching or relied heavily on spirituality or really any message I want to get across that goes beyond the usual pop song content, I firmly believe is better received if it's treated as one normal facet of a breadth of expression. I like to represent life in my recordings, all of it, not just one aspect of it. This is why I've always loved U2 and Prince and others, those not afraid to express spiritual thoughts and questions and doubts and all of that, and good feelings of joy and all, but who don't lean into it like CCM artists and even some other non-Christian artists have. And this is a great place to take a break. Thanks for hanging with me. It's a pretty exciting and interesting topic. We will be back after the mid-roll in just a minute or so. Hey, thanks for checking out this episode of Music is Not a Genre. If you'd like to learn more about this podcast, if you'd like to learn more about the music I do with my band Rec or any other projects or anything else about me, go to nickdematteo.com. That's Nick, DEMATTEO.com, and everything is there. There's even a link to a merch store where you can get t-shirts and mugs and hats and totes and notebooks and so many other things. I'm always adding new products there. Great way to support the podcast. And finally, go to patreon.com/music is not a genre if you'd really like to show your support. My fans and lovely family there get exclusives and other perks and early releases, and they get to suggest topics for future podcasts as well. Thanks for listening to the mid-roll. Now back to the show. All right, we are back. Boy, you know, I had a lot of technical difficulties early in this season, and I've been doing a lot better the last few episodes. But I got to say, things still feel really janky this year. But let's get back to our topic. Watershed number 5, not just all kinds of rock, country, gospel, and pop. And which brings us to the 1990s and 2000s. The 1980s growth continued through the 1990s, and though Amy Grant and a few others had chart success in the 1980s, it's really 1991 when people became super aware of the power of a contemporary Christian music artist crossing over into the pop world. Really, it was Grant's album Heart in Motion in 91 that catapulted this. That Baby Baby #1, which is an awesome freaking song and was kind of like the Call Me Maybe of its day, I contend. 4 other songs from that album made the freaking top 20. Every Heartbeat, #2. That's, which I remember. That's What Love Is For, #7. Good For Me, #8. And I Will Remember You, #20. Her follow-up in 94, House of Love, was also hugely successful and did more overt mingling of pop and religious lyrics. Lucky One hit #18, and the title track, House of Love, hit #37. So this 91, early 90s was a huge watershed and opened the floodgates for artists from all genre disciplines to establish or come out as Christian artists, establish themselves or come out as. It would also bring about a bunch of stealth Christian artists, meaning artists who would hit the pop, rock, alt, etc. charts, hip hop, whatever, and most especially adult contemporary, where much of this music had hit in the 1980s as well, continues to do so to this day, without ever really broadcasting their Christian roots. And I'm not naming names here. Why? Because this is the topic of the bonus MXG video at patreon.com/music is not a genre. Mainstream artists you didn't know were Christian. So check it out. All of this growth prompted Billboard to finally add a Christian music chart in the mid-1990s. I want to say it was 95. That aforementioned expansion of CCM into all kinds of genres went everywhere, with acts from the mid to late 1980s through the 2000s like Newsboys. And these are acts I'm mentioning who were listed as being extremely successful Christian music acts. I've only heard of a few of them. But the fact that I've heard of any means that's some big, news and crossover. So Newsboys started in 1985. They're a pop rock band. DC Talk, heard about them over and over in the 90s. They actually started in 87. They do kind of a mix of hip hop, rock, R&B, and pop. BB and CC Winans, heard about them forever. I remember them from the late 80s, early 90s. They started in 88. R&B, remember them very well. Third Day, Southern Rock. Hillsong, huge mega church in Australia. It's in the name, mega church. And it's called the praise and worship subgenre of Christian music. A quick note that the praise and worship or contemporary worship wing of CCM is dominated by 3 megachurches, Hillsong, and then later on, they were first and continue to be dominant, and later on Bethel and Elevation. All megachurches, and basically assume it's like light rock, pop tinged white choral music, pretty much. A lot of people singing together, light rock pop. Disciple is another band, alt metal. Kirk Franklin, who I've heard about for years, did soul, R&B, and hip hop. Delirious, with the question mark at the end, did rock. Mercy Me, rock. Earthsuit, did rap, rock, and reggae, and was, I believe, the precursor of Mute Math, and I'll mention them a little later. Sanctus, am I right about that? I don't know. You tell me. Sanctus Real, or Sanctus Real, alt rock. Skillet, big one, alt metal, new metal. Casting Crowns, pop rock. Plus One, it's a boy band. So we're getting in more into the mid to late 90s now. You see this change. Zoe Girl, it's a girl boy band. Girl, yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's a pop band, a vocal pop band. 10th Avenue North, power pop indie rock. And Toby Mac's solo career. Toby Mac was with one of the ones I mentioned before. Was it Plus One? I don't remember. You tell me. Lots of solo artists came about also with not very distinguishable genres. Let's just say that adult contemporary kind of feel. A bit granola-y, but with a pop sheen. Chris Tomlin, Matt Redman, Rebecca St. James, Brandon Heath, Natalie Grant. Stephen Curtis Chapman, Jeremy Camp. Like with other genres, but in particular country, some artists began gravitating toward one of two factions: traditional Christian genres like adult contemporary, gospel, praise and worship, and country folk type stuff, and non-traditional genres like punk, metal, alt-rock, hip-hop, new metal, R&B, and even EDM. And that's, typical. Things expand and mix, and then people start to kind of pick a side. And we're doing a lot of that right now. Which brings me to the next section, because we've gotten all the way up to the 90s and 2000s with that list of artists. Odds and ends and contemporary Christian music today, and CCM today. Through the 2010s, pretty much all of the previous genres and factions continue to pump out music from both established and new artists. New, like Lauren Daigle, Corey Asbury, Phil Wickham. For King and Country, they were all more traditional sounding. Lecrae, which is a Christian hip-hop. August Burns Red, progressive metal. Only reason I know that band is because they did Carol of the Bells version, I believe. Hugely hardcore prog metal. And I put that on my Christmas playlist. Flyleaf, post-grunge. Need to Breathe, southern rock. Fit for a King, which is metalcore. David Crowder or Crowder Band. It had a real mix, including bluegrass and ambient electronica. So cool mix. And Capital Kings, who do electropop, dance pop, dubstep, EDM, hip-hop, very electro-based. And again, only reason I know them is because they did a version, I think, of Carol of the Bells that I also put on my list when I was doing my episode at the holidays about that being the best or most effective, most consistently good Christmas song. I couldn't find, again, something else I couldn't find, a definitive list of Christian music genres, but I can tell you there are at least a dozen, and if you really break it down, probably more like 30 or 40. So from what started as, at best, let's say 3, you would have the folksy, you'd have the gospel-y, and then you'd have like the church worship-y. It's broken down into a lot, which any healthy type of music will do. Another note is that, like with country and hip-hop, for some reason, artists outside of the contemporary Christian music genres have often released fully Christian albums. And I'm not talking about Christmas albums, because everybody does that, almost everybody, and that's great, and I love it. Some are better than others, but I still love that they do it. I'm talking about albums that have nothing to do with the holidays that are fully Christian by non-Christian artists. While this has been going on since at least Little Richard and Elvis, both of whom drifted in and out of Christian records for very different reasons. I mean, with Elvis, it was just he had an interest in that. He was a religious person. But he liked to do all kinds of music. And with Little Richard, he was struggling with his sexuality and all of that stuff, and would at turns either feel triumphant and defiant about it or ashamed about it, and blah, 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 would go back and forth. Pretty tough to watch if you've watched that documentary. Also, Dylan's famous foray into Christianity from 1979 to 1981, he released 3 albums, Christian albums: Slow Train Coming, Saved, and Shot of Love. But this really, really expanded. Now, non-Christian artists doing Christian music in the 2000s and beyond. It's true that the majority of these artists have been country, but not all, right? Sample list that only includes artists who have released full albums or EPs that are Christian. So not just single songs, not just artists who profess their born-againness or Christian faith or whatever, but artists who released full albums, releases, EPs, of Christian music. And also not members of bands who have gone Christian, but the bands didn't. Misprint there, it said Gone Christina. That's a whole different story. So some examples. Al Green went from super sexy music to Christian music. Dion in the 1980s. Did not know that Dion went Christian. Van Morrison released a Christian album. So did Ben Harper. Malice, now known as No Malice, from the hip-hop duo Clips, went Christian. Kanye, famously, Christian album. At least one, maybe 2. Tori Kelly did a Christian album. Justin Bieber's last release, I want to say, was Christian. It was an EP. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but he is now born again. Carrie Underwood Fuck her. It did a Christian album. Alan Jackson as well. Christian album. Vince Gill. Christian album. So again, a lot of country artists doing fully Christian albums. And Montel Jordan. This Is How We Do It. Fully Christian. And that's just a small sample. Consider how many country, soul, and R&B artists have done God albums. Okay. Now, there are some special cases here. People who maybe didn't do a full Christian album but should be mentioned. MC Hammer, always religious, a reverend, I believe, and often did himself, or at least produced for others, contemporary Christian music songs. In fact, John Robert Gibson's The Wall, song produced by Hammer, was the first CCM rap hit, which I believe was 88. Hammer has had religious songs on all of his albums since 1986. Run DMC, Reverend Run. We know him as Reverend Run. He's a reverend. They did the title track of their album Down with the King. It was a religious song, 1993. And he started a gospel label and produced other Christian artists. I don't know if it's still running. It's a good question that I didn't answer. You answer it. Some of these bother me and some don't, and I'll tell you why. If you're an artist exploring your religious, spiritual side, and it means something to you, excellent. Some of my favorite artists do that. And even some of my, like Elvis is not a favorite artist of mine, fully respect that he went there a couple times. Not even, I mean, if you count his Christmas albums, 4 or 5 times, right? Because you're taking an aspect of your life and exploring it within the context of other parts of your life. But those artists who renounced their previous lives and previous music, they illustrate the kind of black and white thinking I hate. That secularism is bad and God is the only good and worshipful songs. It shouldn't rankle me that people giving acceptance speeches for awards immediately thank God first, because there is something precious and beautiful in that. But for some reason, it does rankle me. And I think it rankles me like this. Say it in a different way, thank the spirits. It doesn't matter. Say that, but also, and some of these acts do this. I think it's more important to thank this world and the people who helped you here, more than anything else. But that's just my own personal thing. I get why people do that. Listen, what I say about this is do your thing, whatever it is, but don't make us feel bad about it or about liking what you did before. So there's the difference. And think of how many of these artists who renounced their previous lives went on to reverse that, either in part or in whole. Al Green, Little Richard come to mind. There are also many Christian bands who end up leaving the church because of its restrictions, really maybe not leaving the church. Some of them may still be faithful people, but they left contemporary Christian music because, like with so many genres, there are restrictions put on it within the business and by some artists that make it hard for artists who want to express more of themselves to do that and to feel comfortable. They feel out of place because no one can say what constitutes true Christian music or true Christians. And again, it's why I don't like genre distinctions. I don't trust industry people, and I don't listen to genres that insist on staying pure. But, more on that later. And that later is now, because it's conclusions. This may be hard to hear if you are a Christian music fan, but as a music insider and somebody who knows music, inside and out, I feel like I have some authority to say this. And that is, it's fair to say that the only new thing Christian music has contributed to the music landscape in general is making it more normal and acceptable for artists to incorporate religious themes into any genre. Now, that's a big thing, and good that happened. But I am saying that is the sum total of the differential contribution of Christian music of any kind, right? Meaning this, some genres pop up that have so much new to them, and then those new things spread, like electronic music was just electronic, and then it spread to rock and pop and etc., that you can't help but realize that they changed the landscape of music in many ways, in big ways. I don't think Christian music has done that. I think it's only changed it in that one way. Other than that, there is no one element I can point to that Christian music has innovated. Nothing on the music side, and that's because, like most country music, it is reactive, reactionary, in that it will take something that has already existed and turn it into its thing, as opposed to trying to innovate in some other way. Unless, of course, you go far enough back, and to state again that gospel, blues, and early country were all religious to a smaller or larger degrees, and they very much influenced the development of pop music from the 1950s on. So I will correct my first statement and say that they may have done two things to influence non-Christian music: the allowance of people, expressing Christian and spiritual themes in non-Christian music, and elements like gospels and choirs and anthemic type feelings, I believe, came more from religious music than not. In fact, I've often said that in many ways music is my religion, and that when I go to, let's say, a U2 concert in particular, it feels like a religious experience. So I think I gave Christian music a bit of a short shrift as far as that goes. So, or further back than even the 40s, 50s, 60s, and reiterate how vital the Catholic Church was in supporting and nurturing Western music development in general. So there's another reason that I was wrong. But if we stick to contemporary Christian music, anything from the, late 70s on, whatever, it's really only its lyrical influence that's made any change in the fabric of music in general. Okay, so back to country music. Why? There are genres within which the whole point is to co-opt other genres for their own uses. I just mentioned this. And pop country is second only to Christian music in doing this. I mentioned that in the country episode. It brings next to nothing new into the musical conversation, at least again, not in the last several decades. That said, there have absolutely been Christian songs I have enjoyed unwittingly or otherwise. And Amy Grant, of course, comes to mind. Couple of others I will not mention because they are part of the bonus MXtra video at patreon.com/music is not a genre, in which I talk about mainstream artists you didn't know were Christian, or at least I didn't know were Christian. And I think you'll agree with me for the most part. Full disclosure that much of the Christian music I like has been Christian music, and in many cases that's the only way I know the names of any of these artists. Not all of them, but many of them, and probably don't know any other music by them. I don't know any other August Burns Red song, for example, or Capital Kings. But those songs in that field that are explicitly religious, the Christmas songs, do count. It's beginning to look a lot like Christmas is not a Christian song. I mean, it is, but it isn't. You know what I mean? It's not a religious song. But others, Silent Night is a religious song because it talks about Son of God in one of the verses. Which brings me to maybe the most important point in this whole podcast. What makes a song a Christian song, as opposed to a song that incorporates religious or Christian themes? Well, number one, the most important to my mind, the artist self-declares as a Christian artist, because you get to say what music you do. You don't need to let other people tell you. Like I say, Rec is multiphasic power pop, or I might call it louche studio punk. You tell me what's better. Number two, the lyrics are not just unabashedly Christian, they're also unabashedly faithful, meaning they usually leave zero room for doubt, or very little room for doubt, or if doubt enters the narrative, it's quickly answered by hardcore faith in God and Jesus. Number three, it used to be, and it still is to the hardcore people, that a Christian song would have to somehow name check Jesus or God or the Holy Spirit, let's say, one of the Trinity, or quote the Bible, or quote some kind of, sanctioned scripture or something like that, or a prayer or another religious song. In more modern times, the messaging has gotten more subtle, and I say all the better for it. This means that although major artists like Prince and U2 and Mr. and Rec and many hip-hop and R&B artists and all the metal bands referencing religion, faith, God, spirituality, the devil, more often than we might remember, they can't be classified as Christian music because they don't fit those three criteria. Nor would they likely want to be classified as such, because it would restrict not just their audience, but their ability to enact a full range of expression. So what's possibly more interesting is the bias within contemporary Christian music itself, which I alluded to a couple times. Like other internally restrictive genres, country comes to mind, even certain kinds of hardcore metal, punk, most genres have their issues. The more controlling people on the inside, artists to some degree, producers a little more, and business people most of all, often rejected music calling itself Christian if it strayed too far from the flock, so to speak, if it didn't fit those three criteria. Maybe too much doubt in the lyrics, or too many musical influences from outside the fold, or didn't name check God or whatever, or Jesus, or directly quote scripture or use religious words of some kind. In many cases, it's the same story as the world at large. Inclusivity is not accepted by all, and one's level of conservatism or traditionalism is actually the judgment or metric. So, as with all protests of this kind, including the entire current political climate, and I will mention that next week, efforts to prevent expansion and integration eventually fail. They do. And genres and societies widen their scope and redefine the norms and become more inclusive by default eventually, which is how today's contemporary Christian music is so much more diverse and often hard to distinguish from non-Christian versions of the same genre, which again, bonus MxG video, artists you may have had no idea were Christian. That said, this is also why, just like with country music in the current political climate, there's actually more division now than there was in the 90s and 2000s, because people are taking sides more vehemently and making the quote-unquote defense of those positions more important than crossing the aisle and looking for common ground. Final note here in the conclusions is that the most important things are that A, there are people who love the various genres of contemporary Christian music. It brings them joy, comfort, support, hope, etc. And that makes its existence worthwhile, point blank. And B, artists who choose to create this kind of music in good faith and spirit, puns intended, and not as cudgels with which to beat the faithless or those different from them, should be able to keep having vibrant careers and be able to stray in and out of that genre if they want to. So, not a great segue into the featured song, and there's a reason for that, because though I've never been a Christian artist, I've never really written Christian music at all. I have woven my songs with spiritual and sometimes even religious themes quite often, because those are things that I'm always questioning and that matter to me. Just a few examples in reverse chronological order. Eat Salvation from Kite to Camden, The Sky from Synergy for the Weird, Wonder Wonder from Symphony for the Weird, Me, You, and Everyone from the Sunshine Seminar, Believe the Lie from Distance to Empty, Fall from Parts and Labor, On the One from the Metro Grand Sessions, as well as The Same Way, more or less, What It Is, title track of What It Is, My Grace, if you consider that a metaphor, which I somehow do, from Listen You People, and Behind the Shadow, from a couple of different albums. All have spiritual or religious themes, and those are only a few. Of course, all of these are about doubt or searching for faith or rejecting it, so there's no way they'd be contemporary Christian music songs, but some of the lyrics could be considered CCM or vaguely inspirational, or more likely aspirational enough to make that transition if I was that type of artist. So all that considered, the one song that comes to mind closest that's out and out religious is a song that I have not officially released, at least for now, from a demo I did called Black Eyed Susan when I was still going under the artist name Nick. And it's a song called Higher Ground Again, and I would call it kind of alt folk pop. It's me musing on what God is like, making her a woman on purpose, talking about the spiritual separation and the pain of wanting to connect more deeply to that spirit world, but not being able to get past the physical boundary, even though it may be fluid, more fluid than we think. Only other times this song has seen the light of day online are during the pandemic concert. I did a live version of it, and I posted it on a Rex SoundCloud page a few years ago, and that's the link I am sharing along with that whole demo EP of Black Eyed Susan. But you don't need to do either of that, because you get to hear it in a few seconds, really less than a minute. And if you stick around for a few months or a year, you'll probably hear a redone version coming up on a future album, which I'm not going to talk about much soon. Questions for you. Are you a fan of Christian music? If so, what kind? Which artists? Do you like when popular music gets religious, or would you rather those worlds remain separate? I want to know your answers to all these questions and more, because as always, my objectives here are music conversation and connection. Thank you, and I will talk to you next week.
What she looks like, I wonder how she smells, I wonder if she loves me, and if she's been to hell. I wonder what she calls me, and what I should call her. I wonder if she's answered, and if I never heard. Is that her voice in the wind, calling me to higher ground again? Wonder if I touch her, will my fingers bleed? Will I draw the will to fight or lose on need? Is that her embracing me, taking me to higher ground? 'Cause I can't see, I can't see. The boundary between ourselves is fluid. If our paths collide, we will only get away. I've been holed up for so long that I can't recognize myself. And if I ever knew the way to her, I'll forget. Guess I have to believe that she knows how it ends, 'cause I can't see.